In a case of life imitating art, progressives have cancelled screenings of a super progressive movie in Melbourne. It appears that the cinema that was due to screen it reneged at the last minute, seemingly because they feared disruptions from progressives, something that Pauline Hanson talked about with Peter Credlin. And here's what she had to say.
I'm not sure if you've heard today, but our Melbourne screening tomorrow in the cinema has been cancelled. We knew that this was a risk. We knew that with the pressure and the rise in the polls, people would be afraid. But it actually just shows exactly to the point what the movie's about the woke society today. That people are afraid to allow people freedom of speech, freedom of critical thinking. And actually what it's going to do is have the opposite effect of what they feel. Instead of shutting us down, it's actually going to create more interest. It's actually going to help us rise in the polls even more because people are curious. So thank you very much. Well done.
Why the cancellation? Why the cancellation, Lee? What's been the reason?
Look, and this is the thing, they skate around the reason as to why, but we know what the reason is why. They're afraid of the backlash.
So
they're
it's done
afraid,
by the cinema? It's done by the cinema?
Correct. The cinema in Melbourne have reneged on their contract agreements less than 48 hours prior to the screening, which is a shame.
So we can see the progressives were going out of their way to try to get a super progressive movie cancelled. The whole irony of this, however, is plain for all to see. The movie was about the problems of those types of cancellations, the problems of groupthink, the problems of dividing people rather than listening to people's ideas, and the problems of progressives going around shutting down wrongthink. That is the whole premise of a large portion of the movie. And the movie hilariously sends up precisely the problems with the tactics that the progressives were using to cancel this movie. Pauline Hanson released a statement on One Nation's website, and it reads as follows. Super progressives are handing a free publicity to One Nation's rollout of a super progressive movie by cancelling a sold-out premiere screening in Melbourne at the last minute. One Nation leader Senator Pauline Hanson, who was given a standing ovation at last night's sold-out premiere screening in Sydney, said she doesn't accept excuses for cancelling premieres in Melbourne and Hobart, the former less than 48 hours before it's supposed to be screened, and suspected political foul play. Now, if a cinema is going to cancel something last minute, reneging on a contract, potentially exposing themselves to costs, clearly they're doing it for a potential reason. Part of it could be management has a particular political view, but more likely, they were facing some backlash and some pressure from members of the public, potentially were going to wreak havoc on the film, regardless of whether there was a specific threat or the fear of a threat, it still holds. The movie is being proven right by these cancellations. Now the statement then continues on. This country has become so rigidly politically correct and so frightened of giving imaginary offence to imaginary people, they're calling this the most dangerous movie in Australia, when in truth it is a love letter to Australia. And indeed, if you're thinking back to the danger of this, well, Parliament House refused to make a screening of this as well. Now, the statement then says, I have much stronger confidence in the Australian people's ability to take a joke and appreciate political satire. All of the premiere screenings of a super progressive movie across Australia have been sold out. In Melbourne, we put on 2 screenings to accommodate the crowds. Holly Valance's new song that complements the movie, Kiss Kiss My Ass, has topped iTunes. Australians are clamouring to see this film. People drove for hours and even caught flights to be at the Brisbane and Sydney premieres. Australians want to go on the adventure, and with the wise 1/16th Aboriginal Murray and Albo's deep-voiced, hairy daughter, Princess Stacey, outside the Nam super progressive bubble in their quest for the victimhood, the ultimate progressive weapon that ended the fabled culture war. It's a journey of enlightenment and self-reflection for these characters, with plenty of action too, as Pauline Hanson cheats death at the hands of Albo, who ends up beheading a very different senator. Once again, a super progressive movie, rated M if you were wondering, has been cancelled by the super progressives. Stepmates had no help from Screen Australia or anyone else making this movie. When we booked the Parliament House Theatre for an advanced screening of the movie trailer, it was also cancelled at the very last minute to maximise the inconvenience of people who came from all over the country to watch it. You can't have real free speech unless you're able to take it as well as give it. Cancelling us only reveals your own bigotry and weakness, or driving a bigger audience to see a super progressive movie. We'll make sure this won't stop us showing the film to anyone who wants to see it anywhere in the world. And like I said, the progressives are exactly proving the point of this movie for it. The movie couldn't have a bigger gift, both in terms of publicity, but also in terms of being proven right. But of course, you can go and stream this yourself online. I'll include a link in the description below for where you can go and stream it. I also did a bit of a review in a prior video, so you can check that out if you happen to be interested in finding out some more information about it. Now again, it's not clear whether the cinema itself ideologically objected to the movie, or alternatively, whether pressure was exerted upon the cinema and they feared backlash, i.e. boycotts, or they feared demonstrators showing up to protest, creating significant inconvenience and blowing out their security budget. However, it does put the cinema in a rather invidious position. After all, now that they've pulled out of this event at the last minute, it makes them look like an unreliable counterparty. Any other person who might hire the cinema might think twice about it. Furthermore, if the cinema itself ideologically objected to the movie, what does that tell us about the type of movies they might show going forward, and about the type of practice that they pursue? Or alternatively, if they bowed to backlash and to pressure, well again, what does that tell us about the efficacy of backlash and pressure? And does that appeasement simply set them up for more failures? Where does it stop? Are all of these progressives just going to bully the cinema or other private businesses into going along with them? At some point, we need to stop appeasing the demonstrators. At some point, we need to draw a line. And the sooner someone does that, and in this case it could have been the cinema, the sooner we're all better off. And the sooner all of this pressure tactics starts to fade away when they realize that it doesn't work. Now, of course, Topher Field has raised the spectre and the fear that this in fact could be rolled out at the governmental level. For example, he's raised the idea that in Germany, the government has tried to outlaw AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is the right-wing party over in Germany. Now, AfD has rather different policies from One Nation, and is significantly more strident in its policy positions than is One Nation. And indeed, on many policy positions, I do not agree with AfD, much like I don't agree with One Nation on all of their policy positions. However, it is a dangerous precedent when you start outlawing parties, because who decides which party is or is not allowed to run? And Topher Field raised the spectre that potentially the new hate group laws might then be weaponized against a group like One Nation. After all, in the hate group laws, the minister has the discretion to deem who is or is not a hate group. Notionally, this needs to be done on the advice or after receiving advice from various security professionals. However, the minister can then just go off on a frolic and do so. Furthermore, the minister could install someone friendly toward his or her worldview in order to ban someone that they happen to disagree with. And this is a problem, because then, after the group is deemed to be a hate group, well then criminal penalties automatically ensue, up to 15 years of penalties. Now, in a separate video, I probably should talk about the constitutionality or lack thereof of the hate group laws, which I do regard as profoundly unconstitutional for several core reasons. To address those just briefly, firstly, I don't think there's a Section 51 power that enables the legislature to actually pass this bill, meaning that it is de facto unconstitutional. Secondly, I think it is a violation of the separation of powers between executive and judicial, because here the executive branch of government is imposing criminal penalties, and that should not happen. It violates the constitutional separation of powers. And thirdly, it would appear to potentially violate the freedom of political communication, in large part due to the lack of due process involved in this decision-making and the lack of judicial review. Now, it is clear that the government, via proper processes, could potentially rule out a group and could potentially render it illegal. However, for that to be proportionate to the type of thing trying to be outlawed, you would need some degree of due process involved. You would need to be able to put the argument to the person and let them at least mount their argument in contrary. Furthermore, you would need to enable a degree of due process and judicial review, things that this bill appears to try to get around, meaning it goes far too far relative to what it is trying to achieve. So circling back around to whether or not that bill could be weaponized against One Nation, I very much believe it could not legally be weaponized, but the process is potentially the punishment, meaning that it tried to tar One Nation as being an extremist hate group, and then let the mud stick, all the while One Nation gets that label removed. We're not quite at that stage yet, but we really should keep our eyes open. And, focusing on a super aggressive movie, we really shouldn't be bowing to the backlash, And I do very much think it is worthwhile streaming this movie, if only to send a message that you're not going to be told what you will or will not watch. Because even if you disagree with the movie, even if you think the movie is wrong in some areas, well, you should still have the right to be able to see that movie and make up your own mind. People shouldn't be telling you what you can and cannot watch. You should be able to, you should be allowed to go and see what you want. And you shouldn't be infantilized into just accepting what the dominant worldview is or what you were told to accept by progressives. You should be allowed to hear contrary opinions. Still, you can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below, and you can let me know your thoughts about whether you're going to see the movie.